Hello everyone, this is Lala, and today I'm going into part 2 of my Big Brother Archetypes video. So last time I covered the nerd slash genius archetype, and the topic of today's video is going to be the quirky slash nerdy slash adorable super fan archetype, and this is for the woman. In a lot of ways, this is the female counterpart of the prior archetype that I discussed, but I do think that there are some notable differences. I think the adorableness of the woman in this archetype is more focused on compared to any of that with their male counterpart. They don't really have to be nerds themselves or geeks or dorks themselves, though that is an element to it. But if they are kind of nerdy or dorky, it's seen as an adorable, quirky way. Honestly, these are women who don't really fit in the best with the popular women, and they do tend to fit into that super fan lane where they tend to be the women who are knowledgeable about the game. And due to that, and kind of having that Tumblr like personality, if you get what I mean, it causes them to be seen as kind of outcasts compared to the others, but they're nowhere near as socially awkward as their male counterparts. So I do think that is a difference. And a lot of these women are not the glasses wearing, braces wearing, nerdy dressing type of people, kind of like their male counterparts are. So there are some differences. Looking at the people that I have on this list, this archetype really didn't exist much until the second era, which is the post-classic era, but of course it got more and more prominent within the last two eras, so we're just going to get right to it. So, the very first person that I have in this archetype is Daniele, and this might shock a few people since when you think of the later people in this archetype, she doesn't really fit perfectly, but like I mentioned with the nerd slash genius male archetype, these two archetypes weren't really officiated in the first era, or heck, even for a decent amount of the second era. But I do think Danielle kind of led the way for a lot of it. I do think that her being younger than average, especially on her first season, has her in a contrast where she was just very, very young woman, arguably too young to be on the show on BB8, who knows so much about the show and who actually was a super fan of the show, where she applied with her father when she was like 18, if I remember correctly, and she knew her history a lot. And we even see in her successive seasons that she was very game body. She always wanted to make these huge moves. She was this cutthroat player, but she did have some quirks to her, despite her not having the quote unquote appearance of it. But yeah, this archetype, it's mainly about women who are hardcore super fans, and or they are more cutthroat than they appear, mainly due to their age or their appearance. And I do think that Danielle having a different appearance than a lot of them causes people to kind of overlook it. But I also think if she only did Big Brother 8, she might not have fit this archetype perfectly, but I do think she kind of fit this role on Big Brother 13 and Big Brother 22. And it doesn't help that she tends to align with a lot of the women that will be in this archetype in her following two seasons. So I do think that it's kind of a good contrast there. Where she always is a game bot, she kind of has a not like other girls mentality sometimes with the other women, and she tends to align with a lot of the smarter, super funny, quirky women, though none of them are for sure or bona fide nerds, if that really makes sense. But yeah, I do think she's the prototype of this archetype, but obviously it would be a lot more evolved since her first season. But I do feel like she plays a similar role as a lot of the women in this archetype. So we're going to move on a few seasons and a few years to Michelle from Big Brother 11. And she's an interesting case because I think she was a fan of the show, but I don't know if she was the biggest fan of the show, if that really makes sense. But obviously her book smart, her awareness, and her quirkiness were hugely emphasized when it came to her casting because, as we all know, this was the season of the cliques, and she was specifically put on the Brains team. So obviously with her being a brainiac, her being a scientist, that was obviously going to put her more in that light, and especially when it comes to the archetype, it just made her more fitting since they knew they're putting her into cliques. So throughout the season, she definitely struggled with getting to know a lot of people. She definitely didn't fit in well at all, even with the supposed side that she was placed on. And it caused a lot of people to bring a lot of vitriol her way, where they tampered her stuff, they went at her, they called her mentally ill, and they threw a lot of slurs and bad stuff at her, pretty much making her seem very, very, very crazy. Despite this, she did have a good enough head for the game, and she was able to kind of maneuver through the game where she made it to the end game. But it caused her to be the lone wolf. And it seems like her quirkiness wasn't really portrayed as quirky and cute, but weird and uncomfortable to deal with and almost maniac-like, or at least in the eyes of some of the house guests. The third person that I have in this group is Kalia from Big Brother 13, and I think she might be an outlier or someone who is debatable when it comes to whether she should be put on here, but I did decide to put her on here. One, it's clear that she's very well versed and very educated, which is something that came up a lot during her intro and throughout her time on the show. She was also a relatively big fan of the game, and she definitely knew her history, so that's another thing that kind of went into her favor when it came to this archetype. Kalia definitely had a decent amount of quirks that we got to see on the show and on the feed, and it definitely wasn't seen as adorable, and I think that's for a few reasons that has to do with her appearance and her skin tone, where it's hard for black women to be seen as adorable in an endearing way, even if they have certain traits that other non-black people have, but that's kind of besides the point. But she was definitely seen as a weirdo, especially by a lot of the veterans. People didn't get her sense of humor at times. They thought that she was very off-putting at times as well. But she definitely had that awkward superfan vibe to her, and it also helped that she was aligned with Daniele heavily throughout the season, where they kind of went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. When it came to their gameplay, they had very similar personalities, and they're still friends today as I speak. So I definitely do think that she fit that role, and you won't find many non-white people in this role, and you especially won't find black women in this role often at all. And she's definitely unique in more than one way, but it's definitely clear that she faced a lot of the pitfalls that the women of this archetype do as well, where they're kind of seen as oddballs, though their knowledge of the game and their book smarts in life definitely benefits them. Okay, so as you've seen though so far, this archetype has been very inconsistent throughout the post-classic era, and we're midway throughout the show's history at this point, and it really starts becoming more prominent from the modern era onwards, and obviously the most notable example of this is Nicole Franzel, who competed on Big Brother 16, Big Brother 18, and Big Brother 22. Obviously, her thing was that she was this smart, innocent, nerdy, naive, uber super fan, though I'm pretty sure she was only a casual fan, but she watched a lot of the seasons, and due to that, she was put as one of the women who had hope in the season. As we all know, most of the women on her first season were either recruits who didn't know a damn thing about the game, and Nicole definitely didn't get a lot of the dynamics of the house, but she was starting to catch on. She was starting to kind of make waves, but then she got caught and was sent home, and then she was made into a huge underdog. And then obviously there's that arc with Christine turning on her, though in my opinion that was really the battle of the pick-me's. Nicole would continue this on to Big Brother 18, where obviously she was already a fan of the show, but she had the experience of knowing the show and knowing the meta element of it, and due to this, and due to her awkwardness and innocence, it caused a lot of her more devious antics, especially when it came to the game, to be overlooked. And even with how she handled some of the other players, all of that was overlooked, because she could always fall back on her, oh shucks, personality, or oh, I'm this naive, awkward girl. That definitely benefited her. I think a part of this is, no, Michigan's not from the South, so she's not a Southern girl at all. But yeah, she definitely used the adorable and awkward superfan quirky girl to her advantage, and we essentially saw the same thing on her third season, Big Brother All Stars 2. Big Brother 22. Though it seems like most of the house was aware of this by now, and she wasn't seen as this innocent girl anymore, and a lot of people recognize how cutthroat she really was. But ultimately, nothing much really changed since she was still making her devious movements, though it seemed like she was kind of playing for Cody more often than not, but her strategy started to work and she got to third place as well. Clearly, she is one of the few people of this archetype who can make it to the end and did grow as a player, and while there was some awkwardness, it wasn't to the point where people thought that she was very odd and she couldn't make any connections. Though it seems like she always makes a few set connections and uses that to her advantage and kind of weaponizes her image and perception. And I think the reason why she was able to do this is because after her first season, she became a social media influencer. So she was all about perception and cultivating false images, and she definitely used that towards her advantage. I definitely think Christine from Big Brother 16 fits the same mold as Nicole does, since she was arguably the only other woman who had a decent amount of knowledge of the game, and they tried to make her being a nudist a thing in her intro, but obviously that went nowhere when she went into the house. She definitely gave off that I'm not like other girls vibe, and I'm so much smarter than the other girls vibe, and that only intensified when she was one of the few women to randomly be brought into the bomb squad turned detonators alliance. She and Nicole bonded over how much they didn't like the other girls, how they're so much quirkier than the others. Now they're so much smarter than the others. But obviously, Christine had to choose between her alliance and her friend Nicole, and she chose her alliance. And that, in addition to some of the other stuff she did, caused her to be relatively villainized throughout the season, causing her to be booed. I think she fits this better than anything else, and I really don't have much else to say about her. She wasn't seen as the quirky girl, but whatever quirkiness she did have was seen as weirdness and her kind of being unlikable. So there's that. The next person on the list is Bridgette from Big Brother 18. I think I have her in another category that she might fit in a bit more, but there are elements of her that definitely fits this too. I do believe she's one of the newbie women who was more familiar with the show, though I think she was more of a casual fan, and she was definitely very, very quirky, which the entire house picked up upon, and she didn't really hide it. But because of who she was aligned with regarding some of the women, and especially Frank, she didn't really integrate well with the house guests. And despite her so-called knowledge of the gang, she was definitely manipulated by Frank at a few points during the season, so her reads kind of just got off. And I do think, despite her making it to the jury portion of the season, she's one of the women in this archetype who's definitely more lost in comparison. And she didn't get along with the other woman from her season that fit this archetype until the very, very, very end. And we might as well get to that person now. The more notable, or I should say, the more fitting person that fits this archetype from Big Brother 18 is definitely Michelle. She was definitely a huge super fan of the show at the time. She was all over Reddit. I believe she was on Twitter at the time too. She definitely knew her history of the show, and she definitely bragged about it. I know she was a nutritionist while she was on the show, and she was definitely branded as the main female nerd of the newbie cast. And while I do think that's kind of accurate, you can definitely tell that there are other elements to her personality where she didn't really fit being an outright nerd, but she was definitely very awkward. She was definitely very quirky, and that was kind of, or it was kind of a mixed bag for her. In a way, it did endear her to a lot of the house guests, but as the season went on, people definitely got more and more and more and more and more annoyed with it. Especially when it came to be revealed, essentially relatively early on, that she's very, very, very emotional and she cries a lot. And that turned her quirkiness from being endearing to pretty irritating. But she definitely had some moments where she was savvy in the game. She definitely had the gumption to play the game, and she was very fearless throughout the season. An element of her journey is that she was definitely very jealous of Bridgette for like the first half of her season. A part of this was due to the fact that they were both close to Frank, but Frank was closer to Bridgette, and Michelle idolized Frank, and that really bothered her. But I think another element of it is that they were kind of cast to represent the same archetype. And I think someone like Michelle, who knew the meta element of the show and the game, saw that, and she was definitely threatened by it. So she kind of created this conflict out of nowhere. And of course, they got over it by the end of Bridget's time in the house. But like I mentioned in the last video, you'll see certain instances like this where two people from the same season who kind of represent the same archetype will kind of clash with one another, and this is a prime example of it for this archetype. The next person on this list is Meg from BB19, and obviously there's not much to say about her since she didn't last long whatsoever and she ended up quitting. Obviously, she was a huge super fan. As she entered the season, she knew a lot about the game. She was trying to align with like-minded people, but this wasn't the dynamic for that, and there's a lot of awkwardness with her that caused her to struggle to fit in with the cast that she was in. And when she was nominated for the first round, and then that whole misunderstanding, the whole misunderstanding with the whole panda situation, she just collapsed, and with her revealing her traumas with the SA, it just wasn't a good environment for her. So I think she's like the worst case scenario for what will happen to someone or a woman of this archetype. So we are making it to the halfway point of the video, and it says a lot that the halfway point of this archetype is Big Brother 19, though I think it says how oversaturated this archetype is during the last several seasons compared to like the first 2/3 of Big Brother's history at this point in time. And yes, we're talking about Alex from Big Brother 19. The interesting thing about her is that she's not a super fan at all. I believe she was recruited to do the show, and I think she might have binged a few seasons while in the application process. But despite all of that, she thought she knew it all, which she consistently hammered in over Jason's head, even when she was incorrect all of the times. But she had that faux sense of confidence just due to her personality, and that gave her the appearance of somewhat being a fan. The thing with Alex is that she was a huge gamer in her real life, or at least that's what they told us based on her intros and what she described in the game. And they heavily focused on that, so we can see her as the cute, quirky girl, and she had these weird sayings that she was a tomboy, but she had some girly moments as well, and then she wore cat ears, and yeah, it was very clear that they're trying to make her a huge favorite. I will say that Alex definitely did play hard, though a part of it was her trying to play to lose so she could make an impression so she could come back, and obviously that never really happened. Obviously, she's an outlier in this category for a few reasons. One being that she's not a white woman, so obviously the perception is going to be different. And two, she really isn't much of a fan of the game in general. And three, she really wasn't nerdy at all. She definitely had her quote-unquote quirkiness and awkwardness, but it had nothing to do with her being seen as nerdy or geeky, if that kind of makes sense. But in general, she did all of that to kind of just be a power minion, though I guess it kind of worked since it got her to the end game. And unlike others in this archetype, she did win a lot of competitions. Now we are getting into the second half of this archetype, and it says a lot that Big Brother 20 is the second half of the archetype when there's 26 seasons. So clearly there's a lot of them put within these last few years. And the first person in this tier in the second half is Haleigh, and I'm pretty sure a lot of people will disagree about her being on here. But when you really think about it, I do think that the network and production and casting wanted her to be in this tier. There's a lot of focus on her getting higher education, so they clearly emphasized that she was a smart girl despite her appearance. I believe she was a casual fan on the show, and they kind of wanted to establish her as the all-knowing one, or the only knowing one, who was kind of sabotaged by all of her incompetent allies. Though I think when you look into the layers of the Falte/Hive alliance and how the fan base reacted to them compared to her, I do think that she got the benefit because she was a pretty young, attractive white woman, where the others either suffered because they weren't seen as attractive or they were a racial/ethnic minority. So she was kind of put into the savior role because she had the look, essentially. She did have a few quirks, but wasn't anywhere near the amount that the others did in this archetype. But they're clearly trying to set her up as some sort of fan who's just screwed over by her circumstances, kind of like a Nicole from Big Brother 16, ironically, but it obviously didn't pan out the way they wanted it to. And she fit another archetype that I'm definitely going to get into in the future. We are now going to talk about the final person of this archetype from the modern era of Big Brother, and that is Nicole Anderson, who competed on Big Brother 21 and Big Brother 22. Just by looking at her on paper, it's clear that she's probably the most prototypical person of this archetype, where she was definitely a big enough fan of the show. She was very quirky, she was very odd, she was very nerdy, and she definitely had a quote-unquote cuteness to her weirdness that the house found very endearing, especially later on in Big Brother 21 when the messiness of the earlier portion of the season kind of withered away and she was one of the final left that wasn't in that hugely unlikable big group. And then her also working with Cliff definitely added onto that weird quirky girl element, where they also became a lot more strategically aligned with one another and they relied on one another, so it kind of gave her this huge underdog push, especially when it came to the fan base. And she was seen as one of the good ones, where it was very disappointing where she did win, though she definitely made more than a few strategic mistakes. I do think that all of this got to her head, where she comes out of the house being this huge fan favorite. She got into podcasting about Big Brother and reality TV. She was trying to monetize off being a huge favorite, and it definitely made sense. And it seemed like they're definitely trying to push her to be like the next Nicole Franzel, potentially, when it comes to CBS really liking her. And of course, with COVID, they decided to do an all-star season because it made the casting process a lot easier, and I definitely think this was a mistake, especially when it comes to Nicole Anderson, where obviously she enters that season being the new girl on campus. It was very fresh, and it became clear during her very short time on the season that she didn't really get a chance to process everything that happened in her last season and to kind of get off that Big Brother hype, where in my opinion it usually takes around 2 years for people to kind of move on from that in a positive and a negative way. So she was thrown into the house. She had a completely different dynamic with a bunch of alumni who knew one another a lot more than they knew her, and some of them didn't even know who she was, but her very recent reputation didn't look good on her end, where I know Nicole Franzel and Daniele, two other women who are in this archetype, were very petty towards her. They're making fun of her podcast. And Nicole Anderson ended up bonding with Kevin, where they were kind of isolated from one another and they didn't know how to adapt to the new dynamics. And then once Memphis won HOH the following week, she ended up going home and the fans acted so ridiculous towards her once she turned on Kaysar and Janelle, to the point where she came out of the house getting a lot of hate, and it became clear that once she deleted her podcast and once she had to watch the rest of the season, she just kind of got burnt out over Big Brother, and it's really a shame what happened to her. It's kind of like a huge rise and fall. But despite that, I do feel like she encapsulates all of the positive and negatives that comes with this archetype, especially if you're a fan favorite and then you come back for another season and you have a huge decline. Now we are in the postmodern era of the show, and there's several people from Big Brother 23 on this list, and I feel like they did that because they wanted a safer, more PC-friendly cast. And the first person in this group is Sarah Beth. She's obviously someone that was a decent enough fan of the show. She knew that she needed to lay under the radar, and she's definitely someone who was I think she still is heavily into cosplaying. That's something that she did. She's very quirky and geeky in all of the interests that she has and that she was very open about in the house and on her social media. Unfortunately for her, she kind of got the Michelle Noonan treatment, where her quirkiness were seen as weirdness and awkwardness in a negative way, where a lot of the house guests really did not like nor jive with her. She had her sexuality questioned, and I do think a part of that was due to her weirdness being seen as a negative, and she was kind of put on the out. Obviously, a part of that's due to the dynamics of the cookout that was a thing on the season, but even among the non-cookout people, she really didn't jive well with many of them in the house, and it didn't help that her person, i.e. Kind, was definitely manipulating her throughout the season in very uncomfortable ways. So she didn't really have that much flexibility, and whenever she suggested something strategically, she pretty much got shut down and frozen out. Claire is definitely the next person from the season who fits this archetype to a T. Not only was she a huge fan of Big Brother, but she's a huge fan of Survivor as well and the other CBS shows she wrote. So I think she wrote like a novel about the strategy for the CBS shows. She was very active online and she knew what the heck she was talking about when it came to the meta stuff of the season. Sorry, not the season, of the show. Obviously, her high intelligence was talked about extensively throughout the season, and in her intro package, she definitely had the nerdy look during her time on the season, and those were the type of people that she bonded with more often than not. Though, ironically enough, she and Sarah Beth weren't the closest on their season. Obviously, she benefited from being aligned with Tiffany, since some people just didn't gel with her and they wanted to target her, partially due to how smart she was, and partially because she was a bit too awkward for some people as well. And obviously, she had her huge backstab that happened at the end with Tiffany due to the whole cookout stuff and her being one of the last non cookout people. I do think that Claire did come off as a bit naive at times, partially because she is being led to the slaughter by Tiffany, but because she might not have had the most experience with certain things, though she seemed to have a very liberal mindset with a lot of things as well. She's definitely a huge super fan of that tea, and she was definitely awkward, but I don't think she was bashed for it, but she wasn't really seen as adorable either. The second to last person that I am fitting under this category is Hannah from Big Brother 23, and I do think she fits this for a few reasons. One, obviously she is very smart and intellectual. She graduated high school a few years early, causing her to enroll in and graduate post-secondary school very early, and I think she was only like 21 by the time she did this season, so she's very ahead of the curb by educationally compared to people her age. She said that she recently got into the show like a year or two before being on the season, but she was on the online community. She did a lot of research, so she definitely fit the super fan or the uber fan element of it as well. And another reason why she fits this category is she's extremely young. It's very rare for them to cast people in their very early 20s to be on the show for a variety of reasons. And due to her age, she was definitely infantilized and babied throughout the season, which was a positive and a negative pertaining how people saw her in the game and as a respectable player. And she definitely weaponized that at a few points in times, but other times it didn't cause her to really be respected, and people just put that on her. Anyways, I definitely do think that it's interesting that she was this archetype, and it exemplifies the change with the diversity quotas that this era brought in, since most of the people of this archetype are white, and obviously she's mixed race, but she's not mixed with white, so it shows people of different racial groups being put into archetypes that they most likely wouldn't have been in prior eras. And that's really all I have to say about Hannah, to be honest. And the final person from Big Brother 23 that fits this archetype is Azah. And like I just mentioned with Hannah, it's very rare for a non-white person to be put in this archetype, and I think this is for a variety of reasons. One, for several reasons, black people, especially black women, are kind of robbed of their innocence. Even when they are children, they're never really portrayed in that light, and due to that, they're rarely, if ever, given a benefit of the doubt that would benefit someone of this archetype. The thing with Azah is that she actually was a super fan of the show. She was mentioning older seasons, people from older seasons that aren't really known to the general public, especially in 2021. She was referencing strategies and moments that most of the people of this era didn't really know. So with that in mind, people came into this season expecting a lot from Azah. But as we now know, and as we've known for years since watching the show, knowing what to do and having a pre-game plan and talking in pre-season interviews and actually playing the game and executing it are two completely different things. And when Azah entered the game, she couldn't execute what she was planning. She was really on the outs when it comes to a lot of the dynamics of the house, and if it wasn't for the cookout, she would have known nothing. I think her being a huge empath affected her in a way that, yes, she is very sympathetic and empathetic towards a lot of people, but it also caused her to need to recharge her energy when it came to socialization or socializing with people, which is why she kind of hung out by herself a lot of the time. There were several moments where she was suggesting for people to nominate her. A part of her did want to leave. She really just didn't care. And I do think some of that definitely came from the social awkwardness that she tends, that social awkwardness that she has. She definitely had her own interests and stuff like that, and she was definitely an outlier in a lot of different ways. But due to this being a very circumstantial and a very special season, she was able to make it through. And I do think this is the closest archetype that she would fit, even though her journey on the season was actually very different compared to many of the others in this archetype for a variety of reasons. We are finally moving on to another season, and the only person from Big Brother 24 that fits this category is Brittany. And I believe she's the only one who fits this category because damn near all of the other women who were a part of the season weren't fans whatsoever, and they fit different archetypes. Brittany was definitely an oddball when it came to her interests, her life, how she spoke to people, and it caused for her to not bond with a lot of people throughout the season. She was pretty much outcasted by the women almost immediately, so she kind of clung on to Michael and somewhat Taylor in the beginning part of the season. And even when she was a part of the leftovers, she didn't really do anything to actually integrate herself within the other people in that alliance. She definitely was a rat a lot of the time. She kind of spelled information that she shouldn't have. She was always trying to stir the pot and being very messy. And she definitely showed a more insidious side to her that her initial appearance covered up. I don't think she was seen as adorable by anyone in the cast, and I do think a part of that was due to her being married, so that innocence that a lot of women of this archetype have and benefit from, she didn't really have. So I do think she was closer to like a Michelle when it comes to not being liked, but nowhere near as bad as how Michelle got treated. Obviously, when her performatism was exposed during the early jury portion of the season, it really caused people to dislike her even more. And she really didn't have a chance of winning the season just due to her sheer unlikability amongst the cast and her inability to really form strong bonds with people on the season. So, yeah. The second to last person in this category is Izzy. And she did a lot of research, and she seemingly knew a lot of the meta, not only just about this show, but about some of the other CBS shows. And this was beneficial to her because she immediately recognized that Jared is Surie's son, and once Surie was in the game, she kind of insulated herself within that group. Izzy's personality definitely rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. A subsection of the house really did not like her, but when it comes to the people she was working with, she did get very, very close to them. I think Izzy wasn't seen as the adorable, kind of awkward, because one, her appearance, two, they usually don't give that treatment to less feminine lesbian woman, and three, I just think her personality is just very aggressive and she rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. The issue with Izzy is that she let her fandom take over gameplay where she played Fresserie and Jared to win, knowing that they would always choose one another over her because they're always blood. She never really made any avenues for herself to thrive on her own as an individual, so it was definitely frustrating watching her. And she always thought that she knew it all, which definitely rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. She didn't listen to a lot of her allies that weren't Suri, and it would have definitely benefited for her to have listened to them since she made a decent amount of bad moves, and then when the house flipped on her, she was the first casualty of that. Though this was obviously a result that a lot of people predicted very early on in the season. And Izzy definitely fit that. I'll say that she's one of the more aggressive people of this archetype, and it's not the best for someone of this archetype to be very aggressive, especially since Izzy was flawed in so many other ways. I also noted that she didn't get along with the other person who fit this archetype during the season, and we're going to move on to that final person now. And the final person in this casting archetype is America from Big Brother 25. So she's the one who was heavily in the fan community. Before she was on the show, she knew all the seasons, or most of the seasons. She knew a lot about the show and the game, and she tried to implement that once she was on the show, but with the way the competitions were set up, she couldn't win a damn competition, and she honestly didn't have a good social game whatsoever. She didn't even bond with the other person of the same archetype or people who knew just as much about the show, and even amongst her own alliance, they didn't really trust her. They didn't give her much information, and it also didn't help that she ran her mouth about any and everything. Due to this, and I also think her quote-unquote conventional attractiveness caused her to not be treated the same as many others in this archetype, though I do think the reaction that the fans had more than made up for it. But America in general, she definitely was seen as kind of quirky, though I don't think the house guests saw it as a positive way, though this was a relatively quirky house, or a quirky season, at least compared to usual, but she just didn't really seem to endear anyone. Obviously, she got close to Corey, who kind of fits the male version of this archetype, and that's definitely made sense. Though the house guests kind of saw her as the opposite of innocent. They saw her as someone who was untrustworthy, who was kind of dirty, and all that jazz. Though, like I mentioned, the fan base saw her as someone who was very innocent and they needed to infantilize, and honestly just annoying to watch. And that's really all I have to say about her. She did make it to the end game, though it was mainly because she wasn't good at comps and she was relatively unthreatening in comparison. And that concludes my video. It was definitely an interesting one to look at and even make slight comparisons to their male counterpart. I do have the fitness jocks next, but there's so many people on that list. I'm most likely going to just divide it by gender and see how it goes there. Thank you all for watching. I'm definitely going to continue my Big Brother and Challenge content. I'm probably going to do a few other things here and there. There's also stuff happening on my other channel. Well, there is actual footage of stuff happening. And it's very interesting going through these Big Brother archetypes and seeing how they evolved or devolved throughout the years and eras, and seeing the frequency or lack thereof pertaining certain eras. So we can see how certain archetypes really weren't a thing during the earlier eras, but become more and more prominent, especially over the last seasons. So that is definitely an interesting insight to look into. As you have seen, I'm also starting to do my process of ranking challenge seasons, where I break it down into several categories, rank all those categories, and then I start to combine those categories to create a median for each season, and then I'm going to rank a median. So I'm going to rank all the medians for each season. So that's something that I'm definitely looking forward to, and that's going to be in my format. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with more soon. Take care.